In somehow, I became the head of the underworld. Alone, from I just breathed and became the king of the underworld, held on to his dizzy thoughts and pondered. Did I really give that order? When on earth? While Duke Alsha stood with her head bowed, alone, deep in thought, finally let out a soft exclamation. Ah. Let's start by cleaning up the underworld. He realized, recalling that he had indeed said something along those lines after giving it some thought. Wait, isn't it normal to take that statement as meaning we just get rid of a few unnecessary thugs? Not this level of cleanup. But what truly shocked him was not that Duke Alsha misunderstood his words, but that they actually cleared out the entire underworld of the Asteria kingdom. Is this even possible? Of course, Alone knew that Duke Alsha and Count Zenonia would become major figures in the shadows of Asteria in the future. But still, for them to completely dominate Asteria's underworld like this was practically impossible. In the game, the underworld of Asteria was recognized as one of the largest dark forces alongside the Kingdom of Ashtalon in the United Kingdoms. Most of the underground organizations active in the United Kingdoms were rooted in these two areas. In other words, Asteria's underworld had countless organizations. For them to have taken control would mean they must have wiped out all those organizations, which seemed unimaginable. Did they really wipe them all out? With a heart full of doubts, Alone asked cautiously. Yes, came her response, her head nodding with such strong conviction that Alone momentarily fell silent before managing to speak again. You must have gone through a lot. No, it was thanks to you, Count, for taking care of both the royalists and the nobles. The royalists and the nobles? Yes, since you detained the heads of both factions, the cleanup went much more smoothly. Alone wanted to say, wasn't it you guys who handled that, not me, but that thought only lasted a moment. So, as you ordered, we have conquered the underworld. What should we do next? Duke Alsha's words left Alone speechless. In truth, he had no plan whatsoever. The only reason Alone suggested cleaning up the underworld in the first place was that it seemed the most plausible and something that would take a long time. I never imagined it would be finished this quickly. As Alone pondered what to say next to Duke Alsha, the Duke spoke again. Perhaps next, the Queen. The Queen. Yes, now that our forces have grown, it's time to move. After hearing that, Alone gave his next order. For now, let's maintain the current state. With that command, the communication device was deactivated, and he quietly thought. At this point, it would indeed make sense for the Queen to start moving. Although Asteria was a kingdom where the nobles essentially controlled everything, it was still a monarchy, with a queen at the helm. Asteria's eighth monarch, Cretinia Scion. She was the eighth queen of Asteria, and despite the chaos caused by the nobles running rampant, she had held on to significant power without directly managing the kingdom's affairs or participating in political games. The reason was none other than the unique ability possessed by the royal bloodline of Asteria, and more precisely, by Cretinia Scion herself, the Golden Eye of History. Well, despite the name Golden Eye, it wasn't actually a power related to vision. The Golden Eye of History that Alone knew was simply named after the royal family's naturally striking golden eyes, but the inherited power itself was quite simple. It allowed the wielder to pass on their strength across generations. Like transferring game data, this special power could be handed down to the next generation, and while its explanation was simple, it was an incredibly potent ability. The more generations the power passed through, the stronger it became, granting the royal family enough strength to maintain the monarchy without needing to engage in political schemes. Additionally, nobles naturally became more cautious and avoided crossing the line. As far as I know, Cretinia Scion simply doesn't act because she finds it too bothersome, Alone thought, recalling the indifferent, almost emotionless expression she wore in the game's illustrations. Considering how much has happened, there could be some resistance, but based on her personality, she might just let it slide. He recalled the way she behaved in the game, where she mostly only intervened when one of the 5 great sins descended on Asteria. During those times, she briefly joined the player's party and displayed tremendous power. But aside from those rare moments, she showed little interest in the affairs of her kingdom. Her indifference was so extreme that players even had a running joke, treating her more like a guardian dragon than a monarch. With that in mind, Alone decided to relax. However, the next day. SSSHHH. While continuing his magical research and pondering over a question he hadn't been able to answer, who was the being that whispered to him during the battle against the outer god? He was eating a sweet potato when Evan interrupted him. Count, are you eating sweet potatoes again? Do you want one? If there's any left. Actually, no. You've received an important letter. Evan handed him the letter, lightly brushing the snow from his head. It was sealed with the royal family's crest. This is. It seems that 1 month from now, at the start of the new year, the royal palace will be holding its first ball in 5 years. And? There's more. Yes. The messenger who delivered the letter said the Queen personally requested that Count Palacio attend. Hearing this, Alone let out a soft sigh. And exactly 1 month later, after receiving the royal family's letter and fully recovering from his 5-month-long battle with mana addiction, Alone found himself once again contemplating how to make up for his lack of mana reserves. Count. Yes. He boarded the carriage heading to the royal palace to attend the ball. I'll stop by the royal family, visit the desert labyrinth, and then return. It was a long journey ahead, his first trip in quite a while. In a dark cave near Caliban, 3 figures stood. One was a man wrapped head to toe in bandages, covered with strange markings. The second was a woman with a grotesque circuit tattoo covering half her face. And the last was a man carrying 2 karma on his back. Sal Gui, is everything ready for the spirit summoning? The man asked, looking at the 2. What's there to prepare? It's just the 3 of us. If we're going, it's already done, replied the woman, Ju Ryong, casually shrugging her shoulders with confidence. I'm the same. Do we really need to prepare? The man called Sal Gui also responded in a relaxed tone. Just prepare, in case. Oh wow, I didn't know you could be this cautious, boss. For someone who's killed several royals and more than 2 sword masters, aren't you being a bit too scared? Ju Ryong snickered. Well, I did hear that Deus Macallion is somewhat special. It seems he defeated Reinhard. So what? The 3 of us together could handle Reinhard easily. The man sighed lightly as he listened to their conversation. If anyone else had made such a remark, he might have laughed at them. But knowing the history of these 2, he didn't think they were being arrogant. Everyone present had taken down at least 1 master knight on their own, making them formidable in their own right. Nevertheless, he warned them against underestimating their enemy. Don't be too complacent. Defeating Reinhard means he's stronger than that. His words made Sal Gui and Ju Ryong pause, wiping away the playful smirks they had worn just moments before. Well, if you say so. Let's finish this as quickly as possible. Since it's not a frontal assault but an ambush, we can probably deal with him without even needing to fight. As Ju Ryong and Sal Gui discussed their plan seriously, the man quietly infiltrated the central district of Kurdum, the capital of Caliban, where Deus was located. It wasn't long before the 3 agents made their way into Deus Macallion's mansion. And then? Who are you? Upon entering the mansion, they immediately saw Deus Macallion standing against the backdrop of the blue moon. All 3 agents frowned in unison, as none of them had sensed his presence. The fact that they hadn't noticed him meant that they could have been ambushed at any moment. Yet, instead of attacking, Deus had calmly appeared before them. This suggested that as a master knight, he had already gauged their strength and was confident enough to face them head-on. Do you really think it's wise to reveal yourself so easily? That might have been your last chance to live, Ju Ryong asked, frowning slightly. An assassin? Deus asked indifferently. And if I am? I see. Ju Ryong smiled fiercely as tension filled the air, but Deus remained unbothered. In that case, I'll just kill you. He declared flatly, swinging his sword with a calm, expressionless face. Exactly 5 minutes later. Damn it! The 3 agents stood frozen, staring at Deus in shock. Despite expecting to take down a single master knight without much trouble, the battle had gone entirely differently. Even though it was 3 against 1, they had only managed to fight Deus to a draw. In fact, they were starting to be pushed back little by little. What kind of monster is he? The man looked at Deus in disbelief. Based on what he knew, Deus Macallion had become a master knight only 2 or 3 years ago, and his rank wasn't particularly high. When rumors spread recently that he had defeated Reinhard, the man assumed luck had played a part. But now, in this moment, he realized how foolish that assumption had been. I propose we negotiate, the man offered. Negotiate? Yes, our original target wasn't you, but Count Palacio. Of course, they were well aware that Deus had a strong relationship with Count Palacio. However, given the current situation, the man decided to reveal this fact. No matter how much of a monster he is, if the 3 of us fight him to the death, even he must realize he would have to gamble with his life. The man subtly examined Deus's body. Although there were no major injuries, he could see small cuts scattered across him, indicating that Deus was not entirely unscathed and couldn't afford to remain complacent. No matter how loyal someone is, if their own life is at stake, they'll change their tune. If you give us the information we want about Count Palacio, we'll withdraw immediately. We won't come after you again. But if you refuse, the man added in a voice as low as a whisper, our comrades will come after you, day or night. It was a blatant threat, but the man said nothing more. He knew there was no need to explain further to someone who could perceive strength as clearly as Deus could. And then, it happened. The man stared ahead in confusion. The scene before him hadn't changed much. Yet, one thing was different. Beneath the blue moonlight, he suddenly saw thin, violet threads glowing brightly, now visible in his line of sight. These threads, like a spider's web, had enveloped the entire mansion, or more precisely, filled his entire field of vision. They were coiled around not only him but also around Salgui and Jurayong. At that moment. What? What is this? Everyone there began to move. Salgui gripped his axe, Jurayong clutched the kama in her right hand, and the man raised the sword in his left hand, each one pointing their weapons toward their own necks. This is damned. Stop, stop. The intruders, all with horrified expressions, desperately struggled to move their bodies, trying to resist the uncontrollable force. But it was too late. Ensnared by the violet threads, they moved like puppets, controlled by an unseen puppeteer, as their weapons were slowly pressed against their own throats, regardless of their will. No, no. Please, no. Please, please see. Their terror-filled screams echoed briefly, until... Squelch! In the end, they each severed their own lives with their own hands. Red blood trickled down the violet threads. And the last thing the man saw, as he too drove his sword into his neck, marking the end of his life, was... Don't ever say such things in my presence again. A pair of eerie, glowing violet eyes. On the 5th day since departing for the royal capital, with about 2 days remaining until they reached Tyria, the capital of Asteria, Alone was inside the carriage, reviewing a list. It might be best to take care of the others if possible. The list he was looking at was one he'd created over the past few days, detailing the villains from Psychedelia. They weren't small-time criminals, these were the types that would cause real trouble if they started acting out. Thanks to Duke Alsha and Count Zenonia conquering the underworld, a few of them have disappeared. Unfortunately, what Alone needed to be wary of in Psychedelia wasn't so much the main underworld organizations, but the shadowy factions rooted within that world. They wouldn't show up at first, but once the player began acting, they'd suddenly appear and start causing chaos. These hidden organizations were strong, and there were several that posed a significant threat to his safety. But it was unrealistic to deal with all of them just because they might be dangerous, so Alone decided to eliminate only the 2 most threatening groups. The Proxy and the Ghost Castle. In Alone's experience playing, the Proxy and Ghost Castle weren't particularly concerning when viewed from the player's perspective in Psychedelia. The Proxy, a small but elite group, was strong, but they only appeared if you followed a specific route. As for Ghost Castle, it was similar. If you didn't pursue the side quests in the Kingdom of Ashtalon, you wouldn't encounter them. However, the reason Alone considered these 2 groups to be the top priorities for elimination was that he was no longer a player but a noble of Asteria, and these organizations were plotting to overthrow the nation in the future. Of course, Alone had never seen their plans succeed. By the time those groups were diligently preparing their schemes, the 5 great sins would appear, obliterating the kingdom, making any plan to overthrow it irrelevant. But now, in this world where the 5 great sins had already been eradicated, who knew what could happen? Moreover, the Proxy and Ghost Castle were known to assassinate many nobles in pursuit of their goals, so Alone believed these 2 absolutely had to be dealt with. If you include the Empire, there's also the Bone Eater. Alone glanced eastward, toward the Empire, then shrugged. The allied kingdoms and the Empire were far apart, and most of the events happening in the Empire would be handled by the protagonist of that region. They said the in-game timeline is the same, so once the original story begins, the protagonist over in the Empire will start moving as well. While recalling faint memories from the past, Alone thought to himself unconsciously. The protagonist over there. Was their name Palyang? The protagonist of the Empire. To be precise, at the time when the original story of Psychedelia begins, a separate game by the same developers, Calypsophobia, would be progressing in the Empire. In simple terms, psychedelia covers the events in the Allied kingdoms, while calypsophobia focuses on the happenings in the vast neighboring empire. Having thought this far, Alone stopped pondering any further. He had only played the early part of calypsophobia before quitting, so he didn't have much information. Besides, Alone didn't need to concern himself with the empire. After all, the empire and the Allied kingdoms were strictly separated, and the only things they shared were a few items. All the events in the empire would be dealt with by Palyang, the protagonist of calypsophobia, and their party. Therefore, the proxy and ghost castle. How should I deal with these two? Alone sat in the carriage for a while, continuing to mull over the problem. The next day arrived, and Count, you can see Tyria in the distance. We're almost there. Did we arrive a day early? Yes, thankfully we made it with some time to spare. At Evan's words, Alone glanced out the window at the scenery of Tyria. Although he had seen it before, Tyria's landscape was still as grand as ever. High, sturdy walls befitting the image of a nation's capital. As he gazed at it absent-mindedly, Alone clicked his tongue. If he had come to simply tour the capital, his heart would have felt rich and expansive, but unfortunately, that wasn't the case. I hope nothing major happens. As Alone gradually entered the inner part of Tyria, he unknowingly wished that while watching the passing street scenes. Of course, he wasn't really expecting things to go smoothly. After all, the fact that the Queen had specifically summoned Alone meant that there was something special he needed from him, and it was highly likely that it was related to Kalfa. Will things flow as I want them to? In fact, Alone had thought of a rather decent plan on his way to the capital this time. If the Queen mentions expanding my power here, I could pretend to be swayed a bit, reduce Kalfa's influence slightly, and then keep pulling strings, maintaining a balance of power between the factions. It was merely a fantasy of his, without any advice from others or consideration of the current situation, but it was still one of the better ideas he could come up with at the moment. In the first place, no matter what, it wasn't a situation where he could openly oppose the Queen, so if things went that way, there was a high chance that Alone's moderate involvement in factional maneuvering could prove useful. Sigh. He let out a soft sigh as he saw the royal palace drawing closer. Late at night. Despite it being a night where the moon hung high in the sky, Raiden had not yet gone to bed and was waiting in his office. The reason was that tonight was the regular meeting of the Blue Moon. Although the meeting was still 20 minutes away, most of the members of the Blue Moon, except for Deus, had already gathered. It wasn't because something special had happened. It was just that all members of the Blue Moon were always required to gather 30 minutes before a meeting. In fact, the fact that Deus hadn't yet shown up with only 20 minutes left until the meeting was a bit unusual, but something even more peculiar was happening. We're getting married. I told you last time, no. We're getting married. I said no. Unlike the usual silent meetings, Yusha and Sealrang had been arguing for over 10 minutes before the meeting even started. Why not? You don't have the right to stop me. Still, the answer is no. This is unfair. Sealrang was adamantly insisting on getting married, while Yusha was desperately trying to stop her. Raiden, watching this, thought to himself, if she's that determined, wouldn't it be better to just secretly get married and report it afterward? But then again, that might be tough. Considering Yusha's personality and her unique fanaticism, no one could predict how she would react afterward, so Raiden remained silent. Time passed quietly as they continued to argue. Rhine. Yusha is being so unfair. With about 5 minutes remaining until the meeting, Sealrang, looking extremely upset, sought help. Raiden turned his gaze toward Rhine, but she appeared deep in thought, as if she hadn't even heard Sealrang's plea. Seeing this, Raiden shrugged his shoulders. He hadn't expected Rhine to respond to Sealrang's complaint anyway. However, don't take it too personally, Sealrang. Yusha has been assisting the Great Moon for much longer than any of us. Raiden's face showed surprise at Rhine's unexpected words. He knew well that during the previous meeting, she hadn't intervened in their argument, deeming it unworthy of her involvement. See? Just listen quietly. To be honest, Raiden didn't fully grasp how Yusha's long service to the Great Moon related to the current situation. Nevertheless, seeing Rhine show such a surprisingly fresh attitude, he relaxed a bit. Oh, now that I think of it, Yusha, I have a suggestion. Ooh? What is it? Perhaps feeling good about Rhine taking her side, Yusha gave a pleasant smile, and Rhine proposed an idea. I was thinking of sending my own report soon. What do you think? Is that necessary? I've already summarized everything from your team and sent it. I know, but I wanted to report something regarding Eye of the Tracker. If it's about that, you could just tell me. Yusha maintained her smile. However, wouldn't it be better if I delivered it directly rather than going through you? As Ryan continued, Yusha's previously bright smile began to fade. I've always handled the reports well so far, haven't I? But this is about Eye of the Tracker. I'd like to speak personally on that matter, as well as give my own report. Exclamation point. Exclamation point. Both Raiden and Sealrang were shocked when they saw Ryan smile slightly as she spoke. Despite spending over 8 years together since childhood, neither of them had ever seen Ryan smile before. They were stunned for a moment. Ihe dash. Question mark. Question mark. Question mark. Ah, excuse me, I just thought of something amusing. As Ryan suddenly smiled even wider, baring her fangs, everyone was left dumbfounded. Could there be some sort of hypnotic artifact from the Great Moon at work? Seeing how drastically Ryan had changed, Raiden couldn't help but think that. It was understandable, since meeting the Great Moon, both Sealrang and Ryan had undergone significant changes, much like Deus had before them. Their reverence for the Great Moon had become almost as fervent as Yusha's, leading Raiden to seriously consider whether the Great Moon possessed some kind of hypnotic artifact. Just as everyone was still reeling from Ryan's unusual grin. Sorry, I'm a bit late. Deus entered, right on time for the Blue Moon's regular meeting. He briefly looked confused by the sight of the other members, who all had blank expressions on their faces, but quickly gathered his thoughts. I apologize, but I need to urgently share something before the meeting begins. As he spoke, the rest of the members, snapping out of their daze, turned their full attention to him. It seems that an organization called the Proxies is targeting the Great Moon. At his words. Who? What? What did you say? Excuse me, what? Everyone's eyes lit up with intensity, each reacting strongly to the revelation. The fifth layer of the Labyrinth City. A place with green meadows and ancient ruins. However, even after half a year had passed, the traces of the battle that took place that day still remained. And there, it appeared. Flutter! With its black cape billowing, and ominous black ornaments hanging from its waist and hands, the hooded figure began walking through the fifth layer. It walked the place where mercenaries fought an outer god half a year ago. It walked the spot where Alone once stood. And finally, standing where Alone had finished off the outer god, it tilted its head side to side, as if finding something very curious, or perhaps something it couldn't quite understand. How much time had passed? A moment ago, it had stood still, staring at the ground without the slightest movement. Then, with a smile that spread across its face, it opened its mouth, as if finding something truly amusing. I never expected to make it this far. A small murmur. In a voice so ambiguous, it was impossible to tell whether it belonged to a man or a woman, it murmured to itself while glancing around. Then, it casually waved its right hand. View 'em. The black ornament emitted a resonant hum, and after confirming this, the figure turned its body. Interesting. I wonder how much further this will go. It's getting fun. With an innocent laugh, like a child who had just found a fascinating toy. If you manage to survive the next time, things will really get interesting. It began walking towards one side of the fifth layer. And as it walked toward the land with no exit, it suddenly vanished. Though it might seem like an obvious story, Raiden was completely loyal to the Great Moon. Without it, he wouldn't have gained the great power he had now, nor would he have been able to avenge his family. In short, Raiden's loyalty was clearly and firmly directed toward the Great Moon. However, the reason why his loyalty seemed a bit tarnished was because kill them all. Right now. That sounds like a good idea. I agree. Same here. Compared to Raiden's loyalty, the loyalty shown by the other members of the Blue Moon was overwhelmingly stronger. So, where are these so-called agents? From what I've heard, they seem to be spread across the United Kingdoms. There are about 15 in total. I've taken out 3, so there are 12 left. You didn't kill them without knowing their locations, right? Of course not. While I haven't pinpointed them all, I've confirmed the location of the leader and a few others. Good. Hurry up and tell me. I'm going to kill them right now. Sounds good. Seal rang sinister, golden eyes gleamed as he spoke, and Rhine, who had been smirking just a moment ago, returned to her cold, expressionless face, muttering eerily. After this meeting, I plan to kill one of them. It seems there's an agent near Caliban. Even Deus, whose eyes flashed ominously, seemed ready to rush out with his sword as soon as the meeting ended, making Raiden sense the madness in the room. No, I think we should come up with a plan first. Raiden quietly assessed the situation. Even in this very moment, the conversations around him continued casually, talking about tearing and killing the agents without a second thought, a discourse he was still not entirely accustomed to. Among the original members, only Yusha had been like that, while most of the others had acted much more rationally. There's a huge difference. And honestly, I didn't expect even Rhine to turn out this way. Looking at the drastically changed members, including Rhine, Raiden finally spoke. I think we should calmly share information and come up with a plan first. A cautious, but extremely reasonable suggestion. However? Are you serious? Raiden, what if while we're busy making plans, those guys manage to harm the Great Moon? Exactly. I agree. Despite it being the most rational statement, Raiden took a moment to catch his breath as Yusha, Sealrang, and Rhine, following Deus' lead, all expressed their disagreement. Everyone calm down, you're all too excited. Shouldn't we first share the information we have about the agents? We need to figure out how much power they have. Another rational statement. However? Raiden. What is it? Raiden, are you a traitor? Question mark. At Sealrang's ridiculous suspicion, her golden eyes gleaming, Raiden felt dizzy. Wait, hold on. How did we suddenly get to me being a traitor? But Raiden, you've been objecting to killing the agent since earlier, haven't you? It's not an objection, I'm just saying we should assess the situation first. Raiden stopped speaking as he saw the disgruntled stares being directed at him. Realizing instinctively that no matter what he said now, it wouldn't make any difference, he waved the white flag. I'll prepare right away. The four members nodded in satisfaction, resuming their conversation. Watching them, Raiden, who had been thinking about how relatively normal the organization was 2 years ago, except for Yusha, recalled the Great Moon and concluded. There must definitely be a mind control artifact involved. About 30 minutes later. As we talk about this, I'm suddenly reminded of the image the Great Moon showed us. Deus' sudden outburst of worship interrupted the conversation about the agents. Everyone, move now. We'll have a proper meeting once this is all taken care of. At Yusha's words, the blue moon began to move. The next day. After resting in the mansion owned by Duke Elsha, Alone set off for the royal palace in the evening when the banquet was set to begin in earnest. Upon arriving at the palace, Alone said, I'll be back soon, bidding farewell to Evan as he moved forward. And I'll be waiting. Evan, bowing slightly, straightened up and watched. As his master walked into the banquet hall of the royal palace, a large group of nobles followed behind him. Watching the scene of all these nobles, who essentially controlled Asteria, following behind Alone, Evan once again felt the weight of Alone's position. Well, the Count's fame is already immense. Plus, he's the leader of Kalfa. Although Alone himself seemed indifferent to his fame, the difference was stark for Evan, who was witnessing his master's growing influence in real time. In contrast to the old days, when Alone was shunned or feared at banquets, now he was the leader of most of the nobles. And that wasn't all. Given the reputation he'd built, it was clear that Alone would be openly checked by the Queen. Yet, so many nobles still stood behind him. In other words, the nobles following Alone believed that he had a chance, even against the current Queen of Asteria. Well, based on the rumors, it's no wonder they think that. As Evan evaluated the situation, Alone, leading the nobles, realized something strange. Hey, wait, something feels off. He noticed that things seemed to be going a little differently than he had expected. This looks like I'm heading straight into a confrontation, doesn't it? He glanced back subtly. Behind him, a large number of nobles, all his supporters, were following him. No, this isn't the image I had in mind. His plan had been to get a reasonable scolding during the audience with the Queen before the banquet and make a plausible excuse for maintaining Kalfa. But now, with this many people storming in, it didn't seem like it would end with just a scolding. But there was nothing he could do now, so he continued on and entered the banquet hall. Oh. The moment he stepped inside, he couldn't help but admire it. The banquet hall, fitting its reputation, was larger and more beautiful than any hall Alone had ever been to. Standing there, dazed, staring at the ceiling, Alone soon felt the eyes of the nobles in the hall on him. From what Alone could tell, the nobles' gazes fell into two categories. One was admiration and respect. The other was blatant ridicule. And naturally, the latter group far outnumbered the former. He had a rough idea why the nobles in the hall were wearing such expressions. They probably think I've been growing my power recklessly, only to get smacked down by the queen. Realizing that the nobles sneering at him mostly belonged to either the aristocratic faction or the royalist faction, Alone let out a small sigh before continuing on his way to meet the queen. At the far end of the grand ballroom, he could see her. Cretinia Scion, the 8th monarch of Asteria. As he walked closer from afar, Alone noticed how stunningly beautiful Queen Cretinia Scion was. Her golden eyes, a symbol of the royal bloodline of Asteria, sparkled brilliantly as they reflected the light from the terrace, even though her expression remained emotionless. Her beauty was so striking that it could cause any noble to risk a momentary glance, committing an act of irreverence. However, Alone's focus was on the hope that what was about to happen would unfold in his favor, so her appearance was not his priority. And then, "Loyal servant of Asteria, I stand before your majesty," Alone said, bowing deeply in a formal greeting as he reached Cretinia Scion. The queen, who had been silent up until then, spoke. "Raise your head." Her face remained emotionless. At her command, Alone naturally lifted his head. "Are you the Count of Palatio?" "Yes." At the sound of the queen's voice, the nobles who had been smirking at Alone all broke into smiles. This moment was a crucial spectacle for the nobles of both the royalist and aristocratic factions, who had been eagerly anticipating the downfall of Calfa, which had been a thorn in their side. As a result, they all wore malicious smiles while watching the Count of Palatio. But their smug expressions vanished in an instant, and they were left with blank, dumbfounded faces. The reason? Very well, Count of Palatio, I shall bestow upon you the title of Marquis. When Queen Cretinia Scion spoke these words, Alone couldn't help but respond in a daze. What? He unconsciously let out a bewildered sound. The nobles' faces were filled with confusion. The nobles who followed behind Alone also wore bewildered expressions. The nobles who had anticipated the growth of Calfa to be obstructed by the king were also shocked and astonished. However, they were not the only ones showing such expressions. Alone, who had just heard such words from Cretinia Scion, was also puzzled by the situation unfolding before him. A marquis. For a noble, a title carried immense significance. It was similar to a social ranking, and a marquisate would grant Alone far more power than his current countship. From the land holdings to the number of private soldiers he could raise, it would affect many aspects of his life. There would also be no awkwardness in leading a faction within noble society. Although Alone, as a count, had already become the leader of Calfa, it was an anomaly. According to the rules of noble society, it was impossible for a mere count to occupy such a high position. It could be considered an unusual structure. But if Cretinia Scion were to raise his title to Marquis, such an unusual structure in Calfa would immediately be resolved. In other words, Cretinia Scion was not restraining Calfa, but rather helping them. What is this? Alone couldn't help but look up at her with a blank expression, but Scion casually rested her chin on her hand and spoke. "I've heard the stories. That you have eradicated all the pests devouring Asteria. This is your reward." Her calm voice echoed through the air. While her words made sense, the doubt still remained. After all, there was no reason for her to reward him based on such logic. It feels like she's just using this as an excuse to promote me to Marquis. Alone glanced at the queen. Was she confident that she could crush Calfa whenever she wanted, even if they grew larger? A reasonable assumption flashed in his mind. Even though he stared directly at her face, trying to read her thoughts, there was nothing but a cold, emotionless expression on her face. At that moment. "Why, do you dislike it?" Alone snapped back to his senses when he heard Scion's voice. "No, Your Majesty." He bowed his head as he responded. In response, Scion, who had never once shown a smile until now, stood up from the throne with a faint grin. "Step, step." With light steps, she walked up to Alone. Then, as she bent down, locking eyes with Alone who had looked up at her, she pressed the side of his right lip with her index finger and pulled it to the side. Alone's expression was now strange, with one corner of his mouth raised due to her finger. It was a strange sight to anyone, but she simply smiled and said, "Smile. You look much better that way." After saying that, she withdrew the finger that had been pressing Alone's cheek. Looking very satisfied, she gazed at the bewildered Alone with her characteristic golden eyes glinting. The queen, who had been watching with an amused expression, finally spoke. "I shall take my leave now, so enjoy the banquet, all of you." As soon as those words were spoken, as if she no longer had any business at the ball, she turned around. Creak! Bang! The massive door opened and closed, and silence filled the ballroom. Alone, who was blankly staring at the spot where she had exited, thought to himself. What just happened? He was left even more confused. After the queen had left, the ballroom, which had been engulfed in silence, slowly began to regain its liveliness. However, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The difference now was that the nobles who had been smiling just moments before were now the complete opposite. The nobles of the royalist and aristocratic factions, who had been expecting Calfa to be effectively checked today, wore expressions as if the world had ended. In contrast, the nobles who had followed Alone into the ballroom were all beaming, congratulating themselves for choosing the right side. And the man who had essentially become the star of the ballroom, Alone, found himself surrounded. Congratulations, Count. Oh no, not Count anymore. Soon to be Marquis. Oh, right. My mistake, Tilda. Whether or not Alone responded, the nobles around him continued to flatter him eagerly. Indeed, Count Palacio, no, Marquis Palacio is truly remarkable. Exactly. When did he manage to win over the Queen? Receiving the admiring, albeit mistaken and burdensome, gazes from Duke Alcia and Count Zenonia, Alone thought to himself. When did that happen? I don't even know. With a bewildered expression, Alone turned his gaze to the door through which Sion had left. What is going on? He began to recall everything he knew about the 8th monarch of Asteria, Cretinia Sion. No matter how many times he thought about it, Cretinia Sion wasn't someone who would act like that. She wasn't particularly interested in governing, but she was someone who would cut down anyone she deemed a threat to her royal authority without hesitation. And what was with that smile? Alone thought back to the smile she had shown earlier. From what he knew, there wasn't a single illustration or story from Psychedelia where Sion was depicted smiling. Her character was typically cold and indifferent. Something's not right. As Alone began to realize that something was amiss, tilting his head in confusion. In one corner of the ballroom, Marquis Filboid, who had been surrounded by other nobles, was staring at him. Count Palacio. Marquis Filboid gritted his teeth unconsciously. Half a year ago, he had been forced to kneel before Alone, and though he wasn't treated as severely as Duke Limgrave, he had been summoned to the Holy Kingdom and imprisoned in a strange cell for about a month, enduring something close to torture. As a result, he had been eagerly anticipating today's events. He had been sure that Alone would pay the price for foolishly expanding his faction. But contrary to his expectations, the Queen had instead granted him a marquisate, as if acknowledging his faction. How is this possible? Gritting his teeth as he watched Alone, Marquis Filboid let out a deep sigh. At this point, there was nothing he could do now that events had unfolded this way. But that didn't mean he would sit idly by after already suffering a form of retaliation. If it's come to this, I'll have to meet them. With a resolute expression, Marquis Filboid turned around and started walking somewhere. 5 days later. As Alone, after having tasted every snack at the week-long ball, was beginning to think about leaving for the colony. Marquis Filboid had already left on the first day and was heading toward Pakistan, one of the territories of the Kingdom of Ashtalon, close to the Kingdom of Asteria. Normally, he would have been cautious about being seen, but now he didn't care. Ever since he had been dragged to the Holy Kingdom, he had lost most of his political power and was no longer the leader of any faction. In other words, he had become a toothless tiger, and no nobles cared about him anymore. Thus, he was able to reach his destination without worrying about anyone's gaze. And upon arriving in Pakistan, he headed straight for the entrance to the underground slums near the territory. Phew! Letting out a sigh, he looked at the ominous underground entrance in front of him. Then, tightening his lips, he took a step toward the entrance. Marquis Filboid had learned that the agent, a person who would kill anyone, noble or royal, for the right price, was located here. With that in mind, he descended into the underground. TSK. He frowned at the sight of the gambling den filled with noisy people and thick smoke but continued walking. The person he was looking for would be deeper inside. As he made his way further into the den, he whispered the passphrase to a man blocking his way, then opened a firmly closed door without hesitation. And then... Who? Inside the room, Marquis Filboid saw a young girl. No, to be more precise, a girl with radiant blonde hair and an innocent expression. And next to her, lying face down on the floor, was a headless corpse, its body horribly mangled. Marquis Filboid grimaced slightly at the sight, but he didn't flinch or run away. He had already been informed about the grotesque nature of the agent before coming here. I heard that the agent is a vicious beastman who enjoys toying with corpses, but this is more revolting than I expected. Quickly relaxing his frown, Marquis Filboid reminded himself that he needed to hire this agent. Who are you? The voice of the agent broke his thoughts. It was filled with pure curiosity and innocence, which brought the Marquis back to his senses, and he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of surprise. Even though there was a corpse right there, the agent's appearance was very different from what the Marquis had imagined. But only for a moment, as he soon opened his mouth to speak. I'm here to make a request. A request? Yes, I'm here to request the assassination of Count Palacio. Recalling the recommendation that the agent disliked long conversations, Marquis Filboid got straight to the point. And then, a chill ran down his spine. Hey! Marquis Filboid realized without a doubt that the being before him was indeed the agent. As soon as he mentioned his request, the agent's once innocent smile twisted into something more sinister. So, her lips curled as if amused. You're here to request the assassination of Count Palacio. Her eyes turned chillingly cold. So cold, in fact, that it made the Marquis hold his breath in terror as he faced her piercing golden eyes. The intensity of her gaze made his legs tremble, and he swallowed dryly without realizing it. That's right. As soon as he affirmed, the blonde-haired beastman, now lightly swaying her hair, nodded several times. Ah, I see. So that's what you want? But what should we do? What do you mean? The person who could take your request is already right here. She shrugged lightly. Confused by her words, Marquis Filboid followed her gloved finger downward and saw that it was pointing to the headless corpse on the floor. Oh. Only then did he realize that something had gone terribly wrong, and he let out a soft gasp. Marquis Filboid momentarily felt as though he couldn't breathe, overwhelmed by the chilling aura emanating from the beastman before him. But only for a moment. He quickly reached into his cloak, pulled out an artifact, and turned his body. However, thud! In the next instant, Marquis Filboid realized his body had collapsed, and he wore a bewildered expression. As soon as he sensed the strange feeling coming from below, he lowered his gaze. Marquis Filboid could see it clearly. His legs were grotesquely twisted. As soon as he confirmed the sight, an excruciating pain struck him, and he screamed in agony. What's going on here? The mercenaries who had been outside the gambling hall rushed in as the door swung open. Zap! As the beastman released a surge of electricity and disappeared in an instant. Tilda. The mercenaries, who had been charging into the gambling hall just moments ago, had already been reduced to mere lumps of flesh. And then? Tilda, this is so annoying. I was trying to handle this quietly, but it's become such a hassle. The beastman, who had slaughtered all the nearby mercenaries in an instant, wiped the red blood splattered on her golden hair with a disgruntled expression as she looked at Marquis Filboid. Even though dozens of lives had been snuffed out in the blink of an eye, the beastman, as if it were a daily occurrence, wore an innocent expression. Marquis Filboid felt an instinctual fear rising within him and began to beg, his voice trembling. Please, spare me. The beastman, who had been silently watching him, let out a hum and spoke. Do you want to live? Seeing a glimmer of hope, Marquis Filboid desperately clung to that lifeline. Please? I am a Marquis of the Kingdom of Asteria. If you spare me here, I promise you a substantial reward. A desperate struggle for survival. However, the beastman simply squatted in front of him with a curious expression and stared at his face before asking. Then, why did you say that? What? If you wanted to live, why did you say that? Marquis Filboid, his face full of confusion, couldn't understand at all. Why did you tell me to kill my master? At those words, he realized it. Who this golden-eyed beastman's master was. Could it be Count Palacio? Yeah, master, no, actually, my husband? We're about to get married soon. The beastman nodded with a smile, leaving Marquis Filboid dumbfounded. From his perspective, none of this made sense. that a beastman who had just brutally killed an agent stronger than a master knight was standing before him. That this beastman had a connection to Count Palacio. He couldn't comprehend the depth of Count Palacio's abyss. He could only deduce one thing from hearing about the relationship between the beastman and Count Palacio. Babaraga. The beastman standing before him was none other than one of Colony's Babaraga, the Golden Lightning. Oh, how did you guess? At the beastman's reaction, Marquis Filboyd's mouth dropped open. Why was a Babaraga, who was supposed to be in Colony, here? It was incomprehensible to him. However, without a care, the beastman casually said, "What do you mean, why?" "It's only natural," she answered as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I couldn't just let those who try to harm my master go unpunished, could I?" The beastman's golden eyes were shining brilliantly. But they were filled with a deep, intense murderous intent like never before, and he could sense what was coming next. Thud! After the sound of something bursting, there were no further thoughts from the Marquis. And then, "This will never do." "No, it won't." The beastman, who had blown off the Marquis's head, wore an eerily cold expression and said, "No one, absolutely no one, can touch my master." With that, the beastman disappeared. The royal ball, which had been ongoing for a week, had come to an end. Crytenia Cyan had not shown herself after the third day, and Count Palacio had yet to receive the formal ceremony of succession from the Queen but was now being called the Marquis of Palacio in all but name. What could Cyan's true intentions be? For about a week, Alone had managed to endure the bombardment of what's next from Count Zenonia and Duke Alcia, buying himself time. He had tried to think about the reason behind her granting him a title, but he still couldn't grasp her intentions. In truth, he would have liked to ask her directly, but that wasn't possible from the beginning. So, even though he was pleased to have been elevated to the rank of Marquis, there was still a nagging sense of unease. Regardless, he had to leave the capital and start reviewing his upcoming plans. There's quite a lot to do. First, I need to visit the ruins again to meet that, and I also have to go to Raxus to activate the ring. I've already drafted the strategy, so I'll need to lay the groundwork for the agents, too. Oh, maybe I should visit the Colosseum while I'm at Colony. He recalled that achieving a certain number of victories in the Colosseum event in Colony would grant him an audience with the Queen and the chance to acquire one of the relics stored in the royal treasure. With this thought in mind, Alone began to calmly organize his thoughts. A moment later, he set his priorities. Let's start by laying the groundwork for the agents. Although it was slightly more urgent to meet that at the Forgotten Ruins, it so happened that the place where he would spread the groundwork was on the way to Colony, so he decided on the order. A few days passed, and he soon reached the small territory of Atla, situated on the border between the plains and the desert, moving eastward. And then, Count, or rather, should I call you Marquis now? That's the 10th time you've said that. Call me whatever you prefer. Then I'll stick with Count for now. But, Count, are we in the right place? In response to Evan's question, Alone glanced around. The surrounding landscape was quite curious. On one side, there was a forest, but on the other side was a desert that stretched endlessly into the horizon. As he quietly observed the contrasting scenery, Alone stood up. Yes. Are we going to a labyrinth like the one we visited last time? As he got out of the carriage, Alone replied to Evan's question. No. There's somewhere I need to visit briefly. Wait here. Shouldn't I come with you? No. He then began to walk into the forest. How far had he walked? There it is. The entrance to a cave hidden by vines appeared within the forest. It seemed like a natural cave untouched by human hands. However, Alone knew that the cave before him was no mere natural formation, so he felt a little tense. And rightly so, because inside this cave lay the leader of the agents, whom he needed to deal with. The one infamous in early psychedelia for being known as the Spine Cutter, a boss so notorious that it made players curse even after playing for some time, Ulkarmai. Moreover, according to the law, he was strong enough to face off against at least 5 agents at the level of Master Knights. Given his strength, comparable to bosses encountered midway through the game, Alone let out a small sigh and then he resolved himself. Let's just stick to the plan. With that thought in mind, he cleared his throat and spoke up. By the first covenant, fulfill one promise. A moment later, nothing happened. What's going on? With a bewildered expression, Alone spoke once more to summon the leader of the agents hiding inside the cave. by the first covenant, fulfill one promise. But there was still no response. That's strange. After several attempts, Alone, confused by the absence of the expected response, finally began to walk toward the inside of the cave. As he ventured deeper into the dark cave, before long, a massive mansion, built inside the cave, appeared in view. The mansion was enormous, comparable even to the Count Palacio estate where Alone resided. It was both stately and large enough to fill the vast cavern, a testament to the dignity of the agent leader who resided there. Although Alone had visited several times to kill the leader and steal his relics, seeing it in person, as opposed to through the game's illustrations, was a completely different experience. That feeling didn't last long. Soon, he noticed something odd. It's all destroyed. At first, it wasn't obvious from a distance, but the closer he got, the more he realized that the mansion, which should have been intact, was completely wrecked. When he finally entered the mansion, Alone stood bewildered as he looked at the half-destroyed mansion of Ulkamai, the leader of the agents. Ulkamai had lived for 300 years, and during that time, he had killed countless people. He had beheaded more than 12 swordmasters. He had exterminated an entire kingdom, including its king and royal family. He had also killed the Purple Tower Master, the owner of the Mage Tower. In addition to that, he had single-handedly massacred thousands of knights. 150 years ago, he waged a one-man war against a territory and erased it from the annals of history. His strength was undeniable, recognized by all. He was so powerful that every agent with skills surpassing Master Knights feared and revered him. That's why he felt annoyed. He didn't know by what means, but a presumptuous girl had come to kill him. Annoyed by the appearance of this bothersome gnat, he, who had been hiding for the greater cause, thought to toy with her briefly before killing her. Surely that was how it would be. It should have been that way. Cough. Ulkamai coughed and spat blood, staring at the being before him with trembling eyes. Standing in front of him was a young girl. Clad in a black ceremonial robe embroidered with red, she held in one hand a staff that emitted a chillingly eerie red glow. At first, her appearance posed no threat. But even so, Ulkamai was filled with unmistakable fear as he gazed at her. It wasn't just fear. It was terror, despair, and futility. All these emotions swirled together and ensnared him. Because of her. Because of her. Because of her. Because of the thing behind her? What is that? Due to the dozens of tendrils emerging from the black space behind her. He realized that his perception was caught in an endless loop. Even though he became aware of it, his thoughts couldn't process. The same thoughts kept spinning in his mind. Terror. Despair. Futility. Fear. The horrifying mixture of emotions constantly drove Ulkamai into a pit of hellish agony. And then, why is this happening to me? Amidst this terrible fear, Ulkamai, his eyes bloodshot, barely managed to utter those words. The girl who had been staring at him, no, Yusha, spoke. Because you tried to harm him. With chilling red eyes, she pronounced his sentence to the man who had coughed up blood countless times. At that moment, the black tendrils seized Ulkamai and began dragging him into the black rift. It all happened in an instant. Desperately, Ulkamai tried to resist, forcing himself to stand and swing his sword. But even the sword that had killed swordmasters was utterly powerless in front of the young girl. Ennu tilde. Crunch. And with a horrifying sound, he disappeared without leaving even a corpse behind. 1 week. That was the time it took for the organization known as Agents, which had operated in the shadows for 50 years, to completely vanish. And then, normally, I would have made you suffer more before killing you, but I have things to do right now, so I couldn't help it. Yusha muttered as she looked toward the spot where Ulkamai had disappeared. Thanks Sealrung for that. She gazed beyond the forest toward the desert, specifically at the location of the desert city, colony. I'm in a hurry, so I had to kill you quickly. She turned away. In her hand was a letter sent by Alone. A letter that mentioned he would likely be visiting the desert city once again. At last. A small smile crept onto her lips. It had been 3 days since Alone had personally gone to verify the news of an incident in Ulkamai. As he began traveling again with the merchants regularly heading to the desert city like before, Alone let out a deep sigh under the sweltering heat. Count, could you just use it once? If I use it wrong, it could freeze everything solid. Freezing sounds better than becoming a roasted corpse. Still, no. Listening to Evan's complaints about not wanting to get roasted, Alone gazed at the blazing sun and reflected on the events of a few days ago. What happened to Al-Karmai? Of course, since he hadn't seen a body, he couldn't be sure what had happened to Al-Karmai. Yet, the reason he suspected something had gone wrong was because of the artifact he had taken with him. He looked at the badge in his hand. The badge, instead of shining gold, was a dull grey. In game terms, this artifact could be looted after dealing with Al-Karmai in the mid-game stage of Psychedelia. The symbol of the innocent. I didn't expect to get it this early. Though the badge had no function at the moment, it was known for having impressive stats when appraised, especially for an item you normally obtain mid-game. Just like the ring Alone had received from Heinkel but hadn't used yet. On my way to Larx's to unlock the ring, I should stop by the Labyrinth City for an appraisal. At any rate, this symbol of the innocent was something Al-Karmai had cherished deeply and had cast a binding spell on so no one could steal it. Simply put, if Al-Karmai wasn't dead, no one else could have taken the badge. However, since the badge was now in Alone's hand with no sign of magical interference, he was convinced something had happened to Al-Karmai. Thus, that night, Alone had thoroughly raided Al-Karmai's mansion. He glanced at the treasure piled up in the back of the carriage and smiled faintly beneath his expressionless face. And that wasn't all. His waist pouch was now filled with the highest-grade magic potions he had used up in the recent battle against Kylus. Everything was looted from Al-Karmai's mansion. The treasure wasn't as abundant as I'd hoped, but since this world wasn't one where money simply popped out of the ground, Alone was more than satisfied with the treasure now loaded in the carriage. To him, money was always the right answer. How long had they been traveling this way? Everyone, halt! Ding ding! At the shout from up ahead, the caravans crossing the desert came to a sudden stop, and a bell rang out. It was the signal from the merchant group to set up camp, and seeing that the sun was setting, Alone stepped out of the carriage. Not long after they started preparing the camp. Ah, Count, have you been comfortable today? Unlike the leader of the previous golden-haired merchant group, this time, a rather slim merchant leader approached Alone with a bow. Thanks to you. Oh no, not at all, Tilda. The merchant leader, who kept bowing even though Alone hadn't done much, smiled with a characteristic capitalistic grin and handed Alone something. What's this? Ah, these are products we handle in our group. Over here is wine from the Comor estate, and this side contains food products we get from the Kalmian estate. I see. We brought it hoping you'd give it a try. Alone lightly nodded at the exaggerated courtesy, with the merchant leader bowing so deeply that his face nearly touched the ground. I'll enjoy it. Yes, sir. Please rest well. As Alone watched the merchant leader bow several times before disappearing, he shrugged lightly. In the past, he wasn't treated as a proper noble, but nowadays, he received quite lavish treatment wherever he went. This was largely due to his growing reputation and the rumor that he was the head of the most influential faction in the Asteria kingdom. As a result, anyone who had any awareness of the kingdom's political situation tried their best to make a good impression on Alone, turning into sycophants the moment they saw him. Well, that's only true for people moving near the Asteria kingdom, though. As Alone shrugged his shoulders, looking at the gift the merchant leader had offered in hopes of securing a new business route. Oh really? Of course. He heard Evan's voice coming from somewhere, chatting with a woman after they had finished setting up camp. Wow, that's amazing. Ha ha, well, it's not that hard. As Alone glanced at the woman enthusiastically responding to whatever Evan was boasting about, he soon realized her identity. The merchant leader's daughter, her. He made a strange expression as he watched the two. It seems there are more women around Evan these days. Alone had a pretty good guess as to why so many women were suddenly flocking around Evan. It was because of his own fame. Being known as the only knight of the famous Count Palacio, most women showed interest in Evan, approaching him with admiration. Though Alone felt a bit of a strange emotion at what seemed like a situation where the bear does the work and the peddler makes the money, he soon shrugged it off. Well, after all the trouble he went through, I suppose it's fine. Watching Evan putting on an exaggerated, boisterous performance, Alone couldn't help but think once again. I wonder if Evan realizes. The merchant leader's daughter is looking at him with hawk eyes. Since there was no need to spoil the mood, Alone sat in front of the campfire to avoid the increasingly chilly evening. Tasty. The sweet potato that Evan had prepared was perfectly cooked. A week and a day later, at early dawn, Alone finally saw the colony's silhouette again after nearly a year. Tilda. Though the colony didn't look much different from before, its unique architecture still appeared fresh and new to Alone. After a brief exchange of greetings with the merchant leader, Alone turned around when "Master!" He felt the familiar sensation of Seal Rang throwing herself at him, hugging him tightly. "Hello." Seal Rang, clinging to him like glue, greeted him cheerfully. "It's been a while." "It has." As Alone watched Seal Rang wagging her tail excitedly. "Look at that. Isn't that the Golden Flash?" "Yeah, it is." "Who's that with her?" "Looks like Count Palacio." "No way. The mad dog is actually being so friendly with someone like that." He noticed faint murmurs coming from the surrounding area. Seal Rang. "Yeah. Let go of me for now." "Got it." At Alone's words, Seal Rang immediately released her grip around his waist and placed her feet on the ground. "Did I do well?" "You did." Watching Seal Rang wag her tail happily after receiving his praise, Alone suddenly realized how quiet it had become around them. As he glanced around, he saw that everyone at the southern gate of the colony was staring at him with astonished expressions. Even the merchant leader and his daughter, who had just greeted him, were standing there with their mouths wide open. Why is everyone so shocked? Feeling slightly puzzled by the overly silent atmosphere, Alone scanned his surroundings with a faint look of confusion. Everyone looked as if they were witnessing something unreal, their faces frozen in disbelief. Seeing their reactions, Alone himself became confused. Hadn't he received this same kind of excitement from Seal Rang a year ago? But now, the difference in their gazes was stark, leaving Alone bewildered for a moment. HMPH. Clearing his throat awkwardly to dispel the sudden discomfort, Alone opened his mouth and said, "Seal Rang, I'd like to go straight to the ruins." "Is that possible?" "Of course it's possible." With Seal Rang's words, Alone immediately boarded the carriage. Even as he climbed into the carriage and they set off toward the ruins, the looks of astonishment didn't leave the faces of the onlookers. They were on the road to the forgotten ruins, using the carriage Seal Rang had prepared. Just like last time, they were traveling under the protection of the Golden Manor tribe, but Alone could sense something had subtly changed. Something feels different. Alone glanced at Seal Rang. Seal Rang herself hadn't changed much from a year ago. The only noticeable difference was that her brilliantly golden hair had grown longer, now reaching down near her tailbone. But aside from that, she was the same as before. However, unlike Seal Rang, the atmosphere among the Golden Manor tribe members guarding the carriage was distinctly different from a year ago. They seemed more friendly before. Of course, their friendliness had always been directed towards Seal Rang rather than Alone, but now there was none of the light-hearted or welcoming behavior he remembered from before. Instead, they moved in silence, thoroughly watching their surroundings without a word. Recalling what had happened to Seal Rang a year ago, Alone nodded in understanding. "I guess the betrayal back then hit them harder than I thought." As Alone was thinking that he should be more considerate to Seal Rang to keep her from being affected by such things, Seal Rang suddenly spoke up. "Ah, Master!" She called out as if she had just remembered something, and Alone responded. "What is it?" "Can I ask you a favor?" Alone was a little taken aback by the sudden request but nodded soon after. "As long as it's something I can do, of course." After all, it was largely thanks to Seal Rang that they were traveling to the ruins so comfortably, and he had been thinking he should treat her better, so he nodded his head. Seal Rang beamed brightly, pulled out a piece of paper from her bag, and handed it to Alone. Then, as she reached her hand out the window of the carriage, an artifact pen was placed in her hand, as if on cue. Handing the pen over to Alone, Seal Rang said, "Here, sign it." "Sign?" "Yep." Nodding eagerly, she looked at him with a very expectant expression. She nodded so enthusiastically that her long hair, which reached her tailbone, swayed through the air. At this, Alone couldn't help but think. Is she asking me to co-sign for something? Feeling a bit tense without realizing it, Alone looked down at the paper. The document already had several complicated sections filled in. With a puzzled expression, Alone glanced at the top of the document. A marriage registration form? "Sign it." Alone was left speechless.